Rome's golden age was the most brilliant stage in the history of humanity. Under Trajan, the empire stretched from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River, from the misty hills of Scotland to the scorching deserts of Egypt. 80 million people were gathered under a single administration. Grain, silk, precious stones, and slaves transported from every corner of the world flowed toward the center of the earth, toward Rome. From Capua to Jerusalem, from Londinium to Carthage, stone-paved roads connected continents. Aqueducts carried water from mountains into cities. Amphitheaters held the people together. Everything was grand, everything was permanent, everything seemed eternal, but history knows that the brightest torch casts the deepest shadow. The fall did not come overnight. When the barbarians stood at the gate, much had already ended. The real collapse advanced silently for years behind the magnificent facade, beneath the marble, within the folds of senators' togas. What destroyed Rome was not a single sword, but 1,000 small betrayals, an equal number of small follies, and an arrogance that was anything but small. So what really happened? Within every great empire, the same veins that nourish it eventually strangle it. In Rome, that vein was the tension between the army and politics. During the Republic, the Senate stood at the center of everything. But by the time of the imperial period, this balance had been fundamentally shaken. The army's loyalty now belonged not to Rome, but to whichever commander promised land and money. The 3rd century AD opened the chaotic age historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the era of soldier emperors. Over more than 50 years, 30 or more emperors came to the throne, the vast majority killed by their own soldiers. The office of emperor now belonged not to the wisest or most virtuous man, but to whoever stood behind the most powerful legion. Maximinus Thrax was not born in the imperial palace. He came from a remote village in Thrace and had never seen Rome when he ascended the throne. Those who came after him were no different. During this period, the empire effectively split into multiple parts simultaneously. Under Gallienus, the Palmyrene Empire rose in the east and the Gallic Empire in the west. There was no central authority. Taxes could not be collected. Borders could not be defended. While every region tried to govern itself, print its own money, and feed its own army, the adhesive holding the whole together dissolved. Diocletian found a solution to this crisis. But that solution carried the seed of another crisis within it. He divided the empire in two. To Augustus's, to Caesar's, the system called the Tetrarchy brought short-term stability. In the long run, however, it shattered the Roman identity and institutionalized the deep economic chasm between Eastern and Western Rome. The West would never again catch up to the wealth of the East, the least told but perhaps the most decisive story of Rome's fall is the story of its money. During the reign of Augustus, a denarius was produced largely from silver, approximately 85% pure. As the empire expanded, expenses grew and wars became costlier. The treasury began to empty. The solution was that classic shortcut unique to state treasuries, reducing the amount of precious metal inside the coin. First 85%, then 70, 50, 10. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, the denarius's silver content had fallen below 2%. It was still called a denarius, but it was now copper-coated with a thin silver plating. The result was inevitable: prices soared. Historical records show that wheat prices increased hundreds of times over within a single century. Papyrus documents from Egypt recorded that the same goods had become unrecognizably expensive compared to generations before. As soldiers watched their wages lose value, their loyalty lost value too. Merchants began refusing Roman currency. The market gradually regressed toward a barter economy. The money economy of the great cities slowly eroded, and economic collapse brought another fracture: tax evasion and the immunities obtained by large landowners. When small farmers could no longer pay their taxes, they abandoned their lands or bound themselves to large landowners. This was, historically, the seed of feudalism. Free peasants became coloni, semi-free workers bound to the land. The free citizen class that had made Rome what it was, the backbone of the army, the economy, and society, was dissolving. That small farmer was being erased from history. The word barbarian in Latin means one who speaks unintelligibly, a name Romans gave to those who knew neither Latin nor Greek, but these people were by no means primitive. They were sometimes more disciplined, more mobile, more resilient than the Roman army itself. In the year 376 AD, history experienced one of its pivotal moments. The great westward migration launched by the Huns from Central Asia toppled the peoples in its path like dominoes. The Goths, both Visigoths and Ostrogoths, crowded southward and westward under Hun pressure. The Visigoths asked Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube River and take refuge in Roman territory. Valens accepted. Perhaps it was unavoidable, but the terms of this acceptance were never properly enforced. The lands promised to the migrants were not given. The promised provisions could not be supplied. Visigoth leaders were humiliated and robbed by Roman officials 2 years later. In 378, the Battle of Adrianople took place. The Roman army, the most powerful military force in the world, was annihilated by the Visigoths. Emperor Valens died on the battlefield. The number of emperors killed in battle throughout Roman history barely fills the fingers of one hand. This defeat was not merely military. It was a psychological collapse. The legend of invincible Rome breathed its last on that field north of Thrace, but the Huns did not only push. In the middle of the 5th century, under the leadership of Attila, they swept through Europe like a fire. They advanced as far as Gaul and razed the great Italian plains. Rome managed to stop them at the Catalonian plains, but this victory came at enormous cost and far too late. After Attila's death, the Hun Empire collapsed. But to fill the vacuum left by the crumbling Huns, ever more Germans, Slavs, Avars, and Franks pressed against Rome's borders. Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, Angles, Saxons, Lombards, these names followed one after another. Rome possessed not merely an indefensible border length. It no longer had genuine Roman soldiers to defend that border. The army consisted largely of foederati, barbarian groups who fought in Rome's name but owed no loyalty to Rome itself. These warriors could be loyal, but their loyalty was personal. When their pay was cut or switching sides seemed profitable, they switched. The claim that Christianity brought Rome down forms one of the oldest debates in historical writing. Edward Gibbon, in his monumental work The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, written in the 18th century, argued this thesis powerfully. We know today that the truth is not so simple. But Christianity's connection to the transformation cannot be denied. In 313 AD, Constantine the Great freed Christianity with the Edict of Milan. In 380, Theodosius declared Christianity the official state religion. This transformation had more than one consequence. First, the spiritual structure of old Rome was destroyed. The state cult, the divinity of the emperor, the sacrifices offered to Jupiter and Mars, all of these served as political glue. An important part of what held together an empire with dozens of gods, dozens of cultures, and dozens of traditions was this flexible polytheistic framework. A monotheistic religion imposed a single truth. This brought with it both exclusions and violence and a tremendous expenditure of energy. Second, the conflict between church and state divided the empire. The Arian controversy, the question of whether Jesus was of the same substance as God or merely of similar substance, may sound like theological speculation, but in practice it turned into a life-or-death struggle. Emperors became Arianist, bishops Orthodox, or vice versa. Councils convened, condemnations were issued, exiles carried out, blood was sometimes shed. The state's focal point shifted from the borders to church disputes. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the church grew rich. Vast lands were donated. Bishops gained tax exemptions. Talented people flowed from politics into the church. This transformation was as much economic as spiritual and eroded the state's tax base. That said, it must be noted that Christianity alone could not have brought Rome down. Eastern Rome, namely Byzantium, remained Christian and stood until 1453 AD, a full 1,000 years after the fall of the West. This means the problem lay not with the faith, but with conditions specific to the West. Roman citizenship was one of the most advanced concepts in the world. Into 12 AD, Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to the free inhabitants throughout the empire. This was a pragmatic measure taken to broaden the tax base, but its consequences proved unexpectedly devastating. What did it mean to be Roman? If everyone was a Roman citizen, no one was distinctively so. A special identity, collective pride, shared purpose, these slowly eroded. The Latin language was pushed back by Greek in the East and by local languages in the rural regions of the West. Classical education was expensive and became a privilege accessible only to the elite. The people lost that old civic virtues, the sense that fighting for the empire, paying taxes, and assuming social responsibility was one's duty. It became the business of fewer and fewer people. Bread and circus, panem et circenses, is the most iconic symbol of this erosion, keeping the Roman populace of the capital satisfied, distributing free grain to them and providing free spectacles in the Colosseum became the fundamental political instrument emperors turned to from the 1st century AD onward. This practice pacified crowds in the short term, but in the long term it accelerated the collapse of an independent, productive society with civic awareness. When a people becomes accustomed to being satisfied by bread and entertainment, it loses the desire to carry the state on its shoulders. The quality of the Roman Senate also declined dramatically from period to period. In the first centuries of the Republic, the Senate was genuinely an organ composed of experienced statesmen, commanders, and administrators. By the late imperial period, the Senate had become largely a symbolic gathering ceremony. Real decisions were made not in the Senate but in the back rooms of the imperial palace. The classic tension between the Senate and the emperor had been the source of Rome's dynamism. With the disappearance of this tension, political creativity sank too. A new perspective recently brought to historical writing highlights the natural factors in Rome's fall. Climate change and epidemic diseases between the 250s and 270s AD. A great plague known as the Antonine Plague, whose precise nature remains debated today, swept through the empire. In some cities, nearly 5,000 deaths a day were reported. The populations of great cities like Alexandria may have lost a third or half their inhabitants in these waves of pestilence. This wave of death devastated military capacity, agricultural production, and tax revenues simultaneously. Even more serious was the ending of the climate optimum that had prevailed in the 2nd century and early 3rd century AD. During this period, called the Roman climate optimum, the Mediterranean region had enjoyed an unusually temperate, rainy, and fertile climate. From the 250s onward, this balance broke. Drought, cooling periods, and unproductive harvests followed one another. Grain production fell. Hungry populations abandoned their lands. Feeding the cities became difficult. Climatic pressure increased both internal migrations and the pressure of barbarian populations toward Roman territory. For steppe peoples like the Huns also had natural pressures directing them. Drying pastures pushed them westward, and as they pushed westward, the Germanic tribes before them were driven against the Roman borders. The Roman Empire was in fact never truly one. East and West always lived within different economic realities. The East carried the legacy of ancient Hellenistic civilization, Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, and Constantinople, large, vibrant cities full of trade. The western ends of the Silk Road passed through here. Egypt's agricultural surplus fed these cities. A trained bureaucratic class governed the East effectively. The West lacked these advantages of the East. The economy was largely agricultural. Cities were small. Trade channels were weak. The bureaucracy was both less developed and less capable. The military expenditures needed to hold the West were dependent on transfers from the East. This dependence was unsustainable. Indeed, from the founding of Constantinople in 330 AD, it became clear that the capital and therefore power had effectively moved to the east. The emperors of the West became dependent on the patronage of the powerful emperors of the East. The city of Rome was no longer the heart of the empire, but no one dared say this out loud. According to the traditional narrative, the Roman Empire ended in 476 AD when the last emperor of the West, the young Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic commander Odoacer. This date entered the textbooks as the end of antiquity, the beginning of the Middle Ages, but this framing is largely a construction made after the fact. The great majority of people living in 476 did not even notice that they were experiencing a great historical rupture. Odoacer did not abolish the empire. He merely removed the puppet emperor from the throne and returned the titles and symbols of the Roman Empire to the emperor in the East, to Constantinople. He himself acted as an authority nominally subordinate to Eastern Rome. The real fall was a much longer process. Some historians place the actual breaking point in 410 AD, the sacking of Rome by the Visigoth Alaric. From another perspective, the fall was completed in 455 when the Vandals entered Rome and plundered the city. Yet another approach holds that the actual collapse occurred through the accumulation of centuries of economic, military, demographic, and political deterioration, and that no single date can be selected as a moment that tells this holistic collapse. One thing is certain. The fall of Western Rome brought with it the collapse of all the infrastructure of the ancient world: aqueducts, roads, urban life, literacy, trade networks, into a great slowdown and fracture. Much of Europe in the centuries that followed genuinely regressed to smaller cities, less commerce, less literacy, and more primitive agriculture. This rupture was real and it was lasting. Scene X, the real culprit: complexity, fragility, and human nature. So the central question: why did Rome really fall? The answer lies neither in the incompetence of a single leader, nor in a single lost battle, nor in the spread of a single religion. Rome became the victim of a complex system breaking down on multiple fronts simultaneously. And beneath each of these breakdowns lie humanity's most enduring vulnerabilities. Great power requires vast geography. Vast geography requires a great army. A great army requires great money. Great money requires great taxation. Great taxation requires a great bureaucratic state. And every step of this cycle multiplies the vulnerabilities created by the step before it. Rome struggled inside this cycle. As the empire expanded, administrative costs rose. As resources were depleted, expenditure became more difficult. As expenditure became more difficult, solutions became ever more short-term and destructive. Power corrupts. This is perhaps the most shattering lesson of Roman history. When the relatively accountable system of the Republican period transformed into an emperor who could decide alone, move the army at personal command, and spend the treasury at his own discretion, institutional memory and virtue gradually disappeared. Good emperors came and went. Bad emperors systematically left behind the destruction they produced. And when the system lacked the mechanisms to protect itself against bad rulers, the consequences of a single error in judgment or a single crisis of ambition were felt across generations. External threats become truly dangerous only when internal decay opens the door to them. The Visigoths, the Huns, the Vandals, they were powerful, yes, but they were powerful because Rome had grown weak. The Roman army of 200 years earlier would have annihilated the Visigoths at Adrianople. The Roman economy of the Augustan era could have repaired the Vandal plunder. The Rome of every era had solved its own problems, absorbed every blow, recovered and moved on. What made the collapse possible was that this resilience and this capacity to recover had been lost, and this resilience required education, creativity, equitable distribution, institutional integrity, and civic virtue. Rome lost these things. One by one, year by year, generation by generation, scene she, the continuity of the legacy and the lesson of history. Rome fell. But Rome did not die. Eastern Rome in Constantinople lived another 1,000 years until the armies of Mend the Conqueror crossed the city's walls. This long life was no ordinary accident. The East's strong economy, well-defended borders, capable bureaucracy, and ancient Greek intellectual heritage blended with Christian identity kept the empire standing. In the West, Rome's legacy flowed through an entirely different channel, the Church. Latin continued to be the common language of Europe through the Roman Catholic Church. Roman law became the foundation of medieval legal systems. Even as the roads fell to ruin, the road routes remained. Even as cities shrank, settlements continued. Even as the imperial political structure was shattered, the title emperor was claimed by every era's powerful figure from Charlemagne to Napoleon, and the lessons to be learned from Rome remain fresh today. Every great power carries within itself the seeds of its own decline. The destruction of institutions is slow, but the return from it is rarely possible. Economic injustice poses a greater long-term threat than military force. External threat becomes destructive only when combined with internal vulnerability. And the greatest civilizations prepare their own ends by placing excessive faith in themselves. Rome today lives not in its stones, but in our memory. The traces of the people who laid those stones, who wrote those laws, who extended those roads, with their mistakes, their magnificence, their disappointments, look out at us from within history. Perhaps the truest lesson is this: nothing lasts forever. But something well-built continues to shape even after it is destroyed. And that, in itself, is a permanence that cannot be dismissed. Rome was not built in a day, nor was it destroyed in a day. What destroyed it was the choice, made a little more each day, to be a little less Roman.